Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Toxic Google event on Supersurvivors, the surprising link between suffering and success. In a moment, I'll introduce you to the authors, Lee Daniel Kravetz and David B. Feldman. But first, I wanted to steal the floor because I'm not only the Googler who's organizing this event, but I'm also Lee's wife. And I've been part of this book since the very beginning. So 5 years ago, Lee and I went for a walk, and he had just survived his own trauma, and we were talking about how he really wanted to do something meaningful in the world coming out of that. And we were also talking about how every time he told people about his experience, we heard the most incredible stories back. And we wondered what factors went into how somebody experiences a trauma and how they come out of it. And that was really the germ of an idea that led to this book. And so it's so awesome to be here today, introducing Lee and Dave to talk about their published book that's out there in the world. And so Lee Daniel Kravetz has a master's degree in counseling psychology and is a graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. He's held positions at the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, the National Center for PTSD, Stanford University Hospital, and now works at a private practice in Palo Alto. He's written for print and television, including the New York Times, Psychology Today, Huffington Post, as well as Frontline, Nova, and Sesame Street, which our 3-year-old is thrilled about. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with me and our 2 very cute kids. And David B. Feldman is considered to be among the top experts on hope in the field of psychology. He's an associate professor of counseling psychology at Santa Clara University. He holds a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of Kansas and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in the VA Palo Alto Healthcare System, a medical center associated with Stanford University. Dr. Feldman is the author of 2 previous books and has written for Psychology Today and the Huffington Post and published numerous research articles. He lives in the San Francisco Bay Area with his partner, who's also here today.
An adorable cat.
And they will be in conversation with Dan Ariely. Dan is the James B. Duke Professor of Psychology and Behavioral Economics at Duke University, and is the author of New York Times bestsellers, Predictably Irrational, The Upside of Irrationality, and The Honest Truth About Dishonesty. And Dan also works with us here at Google now in the SB&A team in the Irrational Lab. So it's a great honor to introduce all 3 of these gentlemen, and I'll turn it over to them.
So thank you. Can you hear me okay? Is this okay, or do I need to speak more into the mic? I've got my little lapel thing. I think what we'll do is I'll talk for a few minutes about the journey that led us to write this book and a little bit about our process writing it. Lee will talk a little bit. We'll read from the book for a few minutes, and then we will take our positions here on these chairs and have a little conversation that Dan, and I know Dan is prepared to ask us some questions. So first of all, it's great to see so many people here. I'm told that people tend to come 2 or 3 minutes late to these events, and people were here early, which is great. Sorry, we were a little late getting started. I didn't know it walking into my Foundations of Personality and Psychotherapy class in the fall of 2010, but I was about to embark on a fun and meaningful and exciting journey that would bring me and Lee up until this very point. As Mimi told you a second ago, I'm a professor at Santa Clara University, just down the street from here. And I teach one of the most boring classes on earth, Foundations of Personality and Psychotherapy. This is the class that I think a lot of students dread taking, because we go through theory. It's just a theory course, and they have to take tests and write papers. And these people want to be counselors. So that's not their thing. So we talk about Freud, and we talk about cognitive theory, and we talk about humanistic and person-centered approaches to how the mind works. And I try to keep it a little lively and a little interesting, lest people will fall asleep. I didn't know it walking in that day, but it would be one of the most meaningful groups of students that I would ever teach. It was a fantastic group of students. I can see the classroom now, and seated in front of, or in the middle, in the very middle, it was a stepped classroom, and on the second step in the very center was a guy named Lee Kravetz. Now, I didn't know his name at the time because I'm the jerk who doesn't learn students' names very easily.
Still, yeah.
But I would still don't. What is your name? But I would learn it about 3 or 4 weeks later when I would give a lecture on existentialism. So for those of you who aren't familiar with existentialism, it is a psychological perspective these days imported from German philosophy, people like Nietzsche. And it has a lot of German words in it that bore the heck out of people. So I try to keep students awake by asking them pesky questions and asking them to do pesky things that are designed to make them think. For instance, I ask them to calculate how many years they have left to live. And then I ask them how much time they've wasted up until this point. And generally I get, sort of like you did right there, blank stares in response to this. Sometimes people come up and say it was a meaningful question to ask, and it changed the way that they thought. But what I noticed is that Lee started to tear up. And it's rare in a master's class in counseling psychology that someone starts crying in the middle of a lecture. Perhaps it was because it was boring. I later found out, though, that he came across that tear very honestly. As Mimi mentioned, he had suffered his own trauma. At the age of 29, Lee suffered an ordeal with cancer, one that he would eventually win, but that made him question whether he was going to die, something that somebody at the age of 29 shouldn't have to do. And as a result, he dramatically changed his life. He went from someone who was working in New York as a book publicist, very convenient when you've just written a book, to moving out here, getting his graduate degree in counseling psychology, and eventually becoming an author. Now, this sounds a lot like our definition in the book of what a super survivor is. Someone who encounters a trauma, a tragedy, an illness, a loss, some major adversity in their life, and then not only bounces back, but bounces forward, often revolutionizing their life for the better and often touching the world around them in positive ways. Now, I had done for years therapy with people who were suffering from trauma and serious medical illness, and my research has all concerned how people not only bounce back, but bounce forward in the wake of trauma. And so this started a series of conversations between us that culminated in a summer independent study project where we worked together, and Lee ended up writing a stunning, I think, 20-page paper on some of the factors that help people to bounce back from trauma. I think it's safe to say that that 20-page paper and that independent study project turned into one of the most epic independent study projects of all time, and eventually this book. At some point, we were seated in Nervous Dog Coffee on Mission Street in San Francisco, and we just looked at each other and said, there's a book here. And the rest is not exactly history, but I will let Lee catch you up from there.
Sounds great. Thanks, Dave. So yeah, as we've kind of talked about, this is as much about other people as it is our own personal journeys. And my experience, I was a cancer survivor, and when I bounced back from it, I became intensely focused on the ways that other people kind of bounce back. Like, how in the world do people bounce back not only after cancer, but all kinds of crazy experiences in their lives? Everything from natural disasters to car accidents, things that we have no control over to things we do have control over. And then I met Dave, and Dave, is a professor of counseling psychology, but he's also an expert in hope. And when I met Dave, I knew that there was a partnership here. We had to start writing and working together. His research has been the foundation of a lot of the studies that have worked toward positive psychology. The study of hope in general is just fascinating stuff, trust me. I can't even go there because I don't know what I'm talking about, but Dave does, so you should talk to him about it. But he said to us early on, he said, yes, there's a book here. We need to expand it, not beyond cancer, but also look at all the different types of trauma that people experience. And we spent months and months defining and redefining what a super survivor was. And this was all based on the research. There's 20 years, 2 decades of research that talks about what we're going to talk about called post-traumatic growth. We've all heard of post-traumatic stress disorder and the negative side of trauma, but post-traumatic growth is a pretty spectacular phenomenon, and it happens quite often, much more than PTSD, in fact. And we dove into the research, and the research was fascinating. We saw Things that were counterintuitive that we'll talk about a little bit later. Things that just really sparked our interest, both as clinicians and researchers and writers. And then we started matching up case studies, examples that map perfectly onto the science. And that's when we got to actually meet our super survivors. Now these people started, we started with 1 or 2 and they expanded to about 150 people. We pared it down to 17 for the book. But these people were amazing. I mean, this was one of the best parts of our job. We got to hang out with people who had survived remarkable, remarkable things and had gone on to change their lives dramatically as a result. We met Asha Mevlana, who we're going to read about in a few minutes, who went from a cancer survivor like me, but did something remarkable with it. We met a genocide survivor who went on to become a presidential appointee and ultimately actually had an internship here at Google. I don't know how I met her, but we met a plane crash survivor who went on to change the airline industry for the better. We met a tsunami survivor who went on to become a rabbi, a domestic violence survivor who went on to become a yoga guru, and they just kept on getting cooler and cooler. And there was science behind this. There had to be science behind it, and we found it, and this is what the book's about. Each of these stories and all the science kind of taught us ways to live a life worth living. And I think that's the big takeaway from our book. We want people to learn how to live a life that's worth living. You don't need a trauma to experience that, and that's one of our big messages today. This was a huge collaboration, so thank you to Mimi, thank you to Vin, thank you to Dan Ariely today for helping us out. This is just a spectacular moment for us. And without further ado, we will start to read Supersurvivors.
So we're going to read a sort of abridged version of Chapter 1, which is titled To Survive or Super Survive.
Thank you. To survive or super survive. On the spectrum of trauma survivorship, everyone falls somewhere between hiding under a rock and becoming a rock star. Asha Mevlana lay on a table in a small examination room at St. Vincent Catholic Medical Center in the West Village, New York City, when this thought first crossed her mind. She was 24 years old, dark-haired and beautiful. The technology industry in 2002 was making people all over the city rich. She had a great job at a startup, an apartment in Soho, and a pearl-shaped problem within her left breast. Asha had already guessed that it was cancer. The lab technician's grim look was merely confirmation. The defining moment of her ordeal, however, wasn't the diagnosis. It also wasn't the undeniable sensation that her life was spinning out of control as she underwent 8 months of chemotherapy. For Asha, the defining moment came after the doctors announced that she was cancer-free and sent her back into the world. While she'd been facing her mortality, everyone else had gone on blithely living their lives. Her co-workers talked about the crummy New York weather, the long lines at Starbucks, and the finalists on American Idol. Everyone seemed to place value in such inconsequential things, and she found herself yearning for a time when she did as well. Life as Asha once knew it simply didn't make sense anymore. It seemed empty, so she promptly dropped out of it. I'm not a religious person, but I prayed. Just give me a second chance and I'm going to change my life. I'm going to do what I'm passionate about, she says.
Asha is not alone. According to the American Cancer Society, roughly 13 million people around the world are diagnosed with cancer each year, a number that is projected to double in the next 2 decades. The journal Neuroimaging Clinics of North America provides a similarly grim outlook, with a startling 10 million people worldwide affected every year by traumatic brain injuries. The harsh reality of widespread trauma becomes even more apparent once we combine these numbers with the World Health Organization's calculation that 50 million people a year survive car wrecks, the UN's finding that 1 out of every 3 women will be beaten, raped, or otherwise abused during her lifetime, and the realization that these statistics cover only a small portion of the catastrophes that befall people every day. Harvard Medical School professor of psychiatry Judith Herman calls trauma the affliction of the powerless. The problem is, we're all powerless against the vicissitudes of fate. She writes in her book, Trauma and Recovery, quote, "Traumatic events are extraordinary not because they occur rarely, but because they overwhelm the ordinary human adaptations to life," unquote. Depending on the particular type of trauma, about a quarter of survivors will fall into post-traumatic stress disorder, a painful and often debilitating condition. Others will experience significant depression or anxiety. In the midst of all this adversity, it's tempting to become pessimistic and fall into a kind of fatalistic hopelessness. It's easy to overlook the amazing potential for resilience in us all as human beings. Amazingly, even in the midst of trauma, people continue to smile, to love, to celebrate, to create, to renew. In making this observation, we absolutely do not mean to belittle the impact of traumatic times or the suffering that many have endured and continue to endure. Suffering is real, but resilience is also real. It is an incredible and encouraging fact about human nature that, contrary to popular belief, after a period of emotional turmoil, most trauma survivors eventually recover and return to their lives. They bounce back. And in some cases, they do more. They bounce forward, and sometimes in truly remarkable ways. They refocus their energies on a new calling, on a new mission, on a new path, on helping others who have been victimized, on education, on legal reforms, or any number of other big goals. They move beyond mere resilience. They transform the meaning of their personal tragedies by making them the basis for change. We call these people super survivors.
In the aftermath of her cancer diagnosis, Asha paid for improvisational violin lessons. Now, before surviving the trauma, Asha had no illusions about making a career out of music. You mean like playing for bar tips? No, it never crossed my mind. I was just way too practical, she remembers. But that pragmatism didn't survive the chemotherapy, and after working hard for many months, she began playing electric violin for a few amateur rock bands. Something about this new life clicked. Perhaps it was the unscripted nature that, much like the music itself, was creative and freeing. A couple of months later, when a friend invited her to visit Los Angeles for a weekend, she met a number of local musicians who convinced her she should get paying gigs out here in California. It would be an enormous risk. Asha's entire universe was on the East Coast. She had no job prospects in Los Angeles, no income, no place to live, and a million reasons to go back to her old life. Plus, although proficient in violin, she was safely an amateur. But then again, she was also 28 years old, one of the youngest survivors of breast cancer she knew, spiritually damaged and more than a little lost. From this perspective, she had nothing to lose.
In the origin stories of superheroes, something profound, unexpected, and often frightening transforms ordinary lives. A massive discharge of radiation turns a mild-mannered scientist into a hulking green Avenger. The murder of another's parents leads him to don a black mask and dedicate his life to rescuing innocent victims of a maniacal joker. By the way, I just want to point out that we broke no copyrights at all in that. I bet you can't even figure out which ones they were. But what if these scenarios are closer to reality than we think? According to nearly 2 decades of research emerging from institutions as far-flung as the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and the University of Warwick in England, the majority of trauma survivors report some degree of positive change. These individuals may emerge from otherwise awful experiences primed with something like X-ray vision, which allows them to notice value and opportunity where they might never have seen them before. They may develop inner strength from having lived through an experience beyond their worst imaginings. These psychological gains are known as post-traumatic growth. But even after experiencing such inner growth, most trauma survivors find their outer lives returning to normal. According to research, the majority of post-traumatic growth is internal and private. It's what psychologists refer to as perceived growth. Survivors report that they've changed for the better, and they may feel the benefits of that change, but outwardly their lives don't look much different from before the trauma. Perceived growth isn't fake, however. Though the research is mixed, some studies show links between greater perceived growth and lower emotional distress, as well as better physical health. But sometimes people move far beyond both the life-altering negative effects of trauma and the usual outcomes of post-traumatic growth. These people don't just grow, they revolutionize their lives. They transform and transcend their suffering even while enduring it. These super survivors radically deviate from their previous life paths, often transforming the worst thing that's happened into the best.
So Asha has a kick-ass Viper violin. It's purple and the hourglass-shaped belly is cleaved. Instead of the classic configuration of 4 strings, her fingerboard is laced with 7. Rachmaninoff would have been puzzled but awed. One afternoon, Asha picked up her violin from a repair shop in downtown LA, and the guy who had just made her instrument said he knew Dee Snider, the lead singer of Twisted Sister. who just happened to be trying out electric violinists to join his new tour. Although she knew her chances were pretty slim, Asha auditioned. 2 months later, she celebrated her 30th birthday on a tour bus with one of the top metal vocalists of all time. One opportunity led to the next. With startling swiftness, Asha was hired to play alongside Alanis Morissette. And after that, on a U.S. tour with Gnarls Barkley, opening for the Red Hot Chili Peppers in front of 30,000 people a night. That same year, she performed at the Grammys. Jay-Z and Mary J. Blige both tapped her to play. Her reputation on the rise, in 2009, she played regularly for the American Idol Band and The Tonight Show. Asha had been in Los Angeles 15 months. If someone had told her in New York that someday she'd be playing in front of millions of people, she would have laughed in disbelief. Yet she'd arrived at this place with unusual calm, as though somewhere in the back of her mind she always knew she'd wind up here.
Asha is one of the many people we'll meet in this book who have dramatically altered their lives after suffering trauma, often discovering hidden parts of themselves or contributing to the world in ways they never thought possible. But these people are not superheroes, at least no more than any other trauma survivor. In truth, they aren't even superhuman. Their stories betray their utter humanness. They're stumbling and they're grasping as they wrestle with the fundamental questions we all face. Who am I? What do I believe in? And most importantly, how should I live my life? There is a lot that all of us can learn from their often haphazard but beautiful answers to these questions. To be clear, this is not a book extolling the bright side of tragedy, the silver lining of any cloud, or the so-called power of positive thinking. No trauma is good. Every trauma involves suffering. There is nothing inherently positive or indispensable about atrocities, violence, disasters, or illness. But given that such events are sometimes unavoidable, it is important to understand the incredible resilience that is possible for ordinary human beings. The ability to peer into the face of tragedy and somehow emerge fundamentally changed and able to impact the world in previously unimagined ways. Drawing from research in the fields of psychology, psychiatry, sociology, anthropology, and even business, in this book we explore why and how people transform suffering into personal triumph. Each chapter focuses on a particular principle identified by social scientists, including hope, personal control, social support, forgiveness, and spirituality. But these principles don't always work the way you'd think. We explore how hope has little to do with positive thinking, and how despite conventional wisdom, the disorientation and groundlessness experienced by many people after trauma can ultimately be advantageous. We discover why psychologists think that certain delusions can be healthy, why forgiveness is good for one's physiology as well as for the soul, and why reflecting on death can lead to a better life. Finally, we ask what implications these stories have for the rest of us, regardless of whether we've survived a serious trauma or are merely confronting the setbacks and difficulties of everyday life. Asha's cancer was a transformative and meaningful turning point. It afforded her the freedom and motivation to move beyond her previous life and build a new reality for herself. Instead of hampering her, trauma freed her. But stories like Asha's are not typical. While trauma leaves many people suffering, lost, and searching to reclaim their lives, Asha's experience seems to have provided her with direction. In this book, we discover why. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, and we were just notified that apparently there are books in the back for sale. So
oh, great.
If anybody would like them.
So we'll take our places and we'll welcome Dan to the stage, Dan Ariely, and we'll start a conversation.
So if anybody has questions, feel free to ask as well. Let me start by asking you, how did you get the people you interviewed?
Yeah, so it started very simply. People who had survived cancer, people I met, had said to me, hey, you should meet somebody. And we met Asha. She was actually the very first person that we met. And Asha said, no, I'm not a super survivor. You should talk to my friend. And I was like, oh, okay. So then she put me in touch with her friend. And then Dave would meet people the same sort of way. And then it took us from individual points of contact to major organizations. We spoke to Desmond Tutu at some point. We spoke to, just people who appeared on the world stage and made major changes to the world. and that was kind of how it started, and it just started spiraling after that point. It was a wonderful experience.
And we were looking for particular cases that would exemplify the research. So, I mean, we started by really diving deeply, as Lee said in his opening, into the research and finding out what do the hundreds and hundreds of studies out there say about what helps people to bounce forward after trauma and experience post-traumatic growth. And so when we went looking particularly for case studies that would exemplify that. So the foundation was really the research, and then we tried to put flesh on the bones and make the book more interesting by saying, here's what this looks like in reality.
Yeah, it's fun.
So if you think about Supersurvivors, how much of it is about the individual inherent characteristics versus something that happens to them in the environment? So, for example, the Asha that you mentioned, it sounded like she had good luck as well, right? So you could imagine a world in which she tried to play the violin, and I guess the vast majority of violin players, have a miserable professional career. They end up doing something else.
I'm one of them. Yeah.
So you have to wonder how much of it is the individual, how much of it is luck, how much of it is risk taking. If you looked at everybody here, do you think there would be a way for you to talk to everybody here and identify whether they would, in principle, be super survivors? Like, is this something about them?
Boy, there's a lot of questions in there. Let me see if I can take them sort of one at a time.
They're all great questions.
They're all great questions. First of all, I'm not sure that there is anything. I mean, a question we often get is, are we talking about immutable traits here? There are just people who are super survivors and will become super survivors if they encounter trauma, and then people that won't. Mm-hmm. And that's not what the research seems to say. Although the research seems to say that there are certain things, like being a little more extroverted, having certain kinds of social skills that tend to elevate your likelihood of growing from trauma a little bit. Actually, it's other things that we all have the opportunity to do, things like taking a hopeful outlook, being a realistic thinker, cultivating social support. It turns out that social support and noticing and taking advantage of social support networks is extremely important. Rebuilding one's worldview in a certain way after trauma. I mean, I'm sort of glossing over these, but these are all things that I don't think are immutable traits, something about the person, but are principles that anyone can exemplify. That's what the research says. Now, when we talked to the super survivors, one of the things that we noticed was this incredible humility, that a lot of them said, look, don't present me as a superhuman person. Present me as an ordinary person who discovered a new way of living through trauma. And all of them wanted to make sure that in the book, we got across this idea that anyone can be a super survivor. And in fact, you don't have to wait for trauma to wake you up to begin to really pursue your dreams and your goals.
But some of those attributes that you described do seem like individual traits, like
Sure.
your ability to have a nice social network, right? Somebody who is an introvert, that doesn't like people, will inherently have a harder time with this.
Well, it's interesting. We actually spoke to, does anybody here know Jane McGonigal? I've heard of her. She's, so Jane. So Jane, when we spoke to her about social support, she identifies herself as an introvert.
She is not.
Yeah, well, she wears pink and glitter, but she does, it's interesting because she self-identifies as an introvert. And
should say who she is for those people who don't know.
So I should say, so Jane McGonigal she was a gamer. She creates games, and she had a traumatic brain injury, a very odd traumatic brain injury. She was cleaning her house, and she reached up real fast and hit her head on a drawer.
She was repairing her printer, so be careful.
Yeah, don't let that happen. So she hurt her head, and she had a traumatic brain injury, a concussion. Most people recover from concussions. She was having a hard time with that. So, and she felt very isolated. She stayed in her apartment. She didn't want to leave. The people who tried to come in and help her, she kind of pushed away. She wasn't getting out. And so what she did was she created a game called Super Better. And with this game, it was for anybody who had, it started out with people who just had traumatic brain injury, who were shutting themselves in, but still wanted that connection. So they would go online, they would each give each other tasks, and if they achieved these tasks, and these tasks were very simple, like walk around the block and then come home. You know, look out the window for 5 minutes, give your mom a call, things like that. But every time you do that, you get points. And she perceived a certain level of social support that may or may not have actually been there, and that really helped her tremendously, and has helped a lot of people as a result as well.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about this story is here's somebody who credits herself, whether you believe it or not, with being an introvert. And in fact, at that point in her life, felt very withdrawn. She found a way, a creative way, to reach out. And that is what we find with a lot of the super survivors, that whether or not they necessarily look like super survivors before, they discover new parts of themselves, they discover ways of reaching out, they discover new goals, they connect with their values in a way, maybe values that were partly sort of covered over beforehand, and they change in certain ways. To answer your question, I mean, you said a lot of these seem like personal traits. They are. I study hope, and at first, scientists, I mean, hope has, of course, been a philosophical and religious topic for millennia. But at first, when scientists started to study this about 50 years ago, they treated it like hope was a personality trait. Either you were a hopeful person or you were a less hopeful, a hopeless person. And it turns out that my own research that I've done during the past 10 years or so has shown that hope, this thing that people thought was a trait, is actually very malleable. That if you put people through a 90-minute workshop to teach hopeful thinking skills, that they can dramatically change the way that they think. And you see effects from that 3 to 6 months down the road in terms of their mood, in terms of their ability to accomplish goals, in terms of if you do it on college students, in terms of their GPA rising. So I think a lot of these things that seem to be immutable traits are actually very mutable.
Just as a question from the audience, so how many of you think that if something terrible happened to you, you would change your life in positive ways? How many of you think that you would be super survivors?
Or something like a super survivor.
Yeah.
How many don't know? And how many think that you would be just a plain old survivor?
Just a regular old survivor.
That's pretty simple too, by the way.
Yeah, it's quite good.
Yeah.
So, you know, do people have a sense of what they will be? Like, so people here have some kind of intuition of whether they would be better off or not. Can you? And
That's
is
a
it
really
possible?
good question.
And is it possible that the people who think that they will, like those of you who think you'll be super survivor, that you just take more risk and therefore have a higher chance to experience a trauma?
Great.
Let me take a stab at that, and then I'll turn it over to Lee, because I know he wants to talk about risk.
Yeah.
If I know you well enough.
Yeah, you do.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that question, and I think we just need to put it out there. I don't think anybody knows the answer to that question. That's a fascinating research question, and one that I'd love to do actual work on. Can people who end up super survivors, can they prospectively predict whether they will or not? People do have an ability to self-assess their own level of some of the traits or characteristics or principles that we're talking about. I mean, you all can ask yourself right now, how good am I at achieving my goals? How honest am I with myself when something bad happens, or do I tend to practice denial? Do I tend to paint a smiley face over things rather than accept them? How good are you at acceptance, right? How quickly do you snap back from problems, daily problems when they occur in your lives? How well do you cultivate your social support network? How good are you at reaching out and asking for help when you really need it? Or are you the kind of person that doesn't like to ask for help? I mean, I think you can self-assess some of these characteristics, and to the extent that those self-assessments are accurate, and generally people's are, I think you could predict for yourself. Mm-hmm. But whether just asking it is a prediction, it's an interesting question.
Is it like a little trauma we can just try out and see if it's
Yeah. Well, what can we do to you today?
Yeah, seriously, who wants a traumatic brain injury? I can help you with that.
Yeah, we got a bat somewhere. I do think that so the research shows that 50 to 80% of people, a lot of people don't believe this statistic when we say it, but it's true. In worldwide surveys with epidemiological surveys with tens of thousands of participants, we know that 50 to 80% of people during their lifetime at some point will suffer a trauma. 50 to 80%. And we're not talking about little traumas. We're talking about the big things: natural disasters, major victimizations, physical traumas, assaults, etc. And only about 20 to 25%, as we said, end up with PTSD. The majority bounce back. So I think the majority of us, and that's not to say that PTSD is unimportant. It's extremely important as a topic, and people with PTSD deserve treatment, and the topic deserves a lot of conversation. But 50 to 80% of people in the aftermath of trauma grow. So I think it's actually something that we all have built into us to a certain
Don't develop
degree.
PTSD is not the same as growing. But
Absolutely, and these are not muitually exclusive.
Right, that's the
either.
other thing. They're not mutually exclusive.
Sometimes it's, in fact, well, you can speak to this.
Oh, sure. I mean, we interviewed one of the interviewees, the subjects in our book, survived genocide, and she did remarkable stuff afterwards. She really bounced forward. Works with Oprah Winfrey at the Leadership Academy for Girls as a presidential appointee to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum with her hero Elie Wiesel. On and on. But when you talk to her, she still tears up. She still is quite fearful. She has a lot of the negative effects. She displays a lot of the negative effects of trauma, and that just really really points out that these things are not mutually exclusive. That oftentimes, the negative effects and the positive effects happen at the same time. And to the point though about we talk in the book a little bit about delusion and taking chances. So one of the things that we found was that most of the people in the book had something that we called grounded hope. And so grounded hope, it's two parts. The first part is you look at the situation you're in with eyes wide open. Don't paint a smiley face over it. This is the circumstance that I face. There's no getting around the fact that I've lost my vision. There's no getting around the fact that I've lost a limb or that I have experienced this trauma. That's the grounded part. The hopeful part is looking at the things that you can change. And we found somebody, there's a man in our book, his name is Casey. It's actually his birthday today, so if you're watching, happy birthday. But he survived a car accident where he lost one of his legs. And today, he's one of Hollywood's most sought after stuntmen. He's been blown up 50, 60 times.
His specialty is getting his leg blown off.
It is. It's really great.
Makes a lot of sense.
It's wonderful. You have aliens ripping it off. You have police officers shooting his leg off. I mean, it's actually really harrowing stuff. When we asked him what it was, and he said, he feels like, he thought he could do this. He had this delusional idea, this slightly delusional idea that he could do this and be safe at it. And many people who become super survivors have this idea, this sense of confidence that they can try many different things, and one or two of them will work out. Many of them don't, and that's the important thing to know too. Failure is part of this whole equation. Goal disengagement is part of this equation, but goal re-engagement is also part of the equation, and people try new things.
Let me fill in a little more there.
Sure.
One of the things that Casey said, which is amazing, is he said, look, I feel like, and this is something we saw in a lot of our interviews, I feel like I've lived through the worst thing I can possibly imagine.
That's right.
He was pushing a car by the side of the road that had broken down. He was 19 years old. And a drunk driver careened into the rear bumper, ripping one of his legs off. He said, I feel like I've lived through the worst possible thing that I can imagine. Nothing else is scary. And now I am willing to open myself up to trying a lot of new things and taking some risks because I know I can survive it. And that willingness to take risks, I think what some people would call that slightly delusional sense that I can handle anything, actually is what has enabled him to be incredibly successful.
So this sounds to fit with the research on luck that basically says that there are lucky people and there are non-lucky people, and the lucky people are not better at the roulette, they just try more things.
Right,
and they try
exactly.
at least a little bit, and something seems to be going well, and then they keep on doing, and some people just don't try as much. But it opens another question, which is, what is the cause of the trauma? So if you think about a trauma like a car accident, it's a one-time trauma. It's caused by a one-time event. And then on the other hand, there are things like learned helplessness,
Yes.
right? There are experiences of somebody who's being abused for a long time, that the environment is unpredictable, they don't have control over it, and so on. Do you find differences between the type of, if it's about willingness to take risk, is learned helplessness going to lead to less willingness to take risk, and one-time event are just going to give us more courage than what else can happen?
So there's a lot there too. So let me see if I can take the first part. There are certainly different kinds of trauma, and the type of trauma makes a big difference as to what the outcome will be. So for instance, we know that for one-time traumas that are non-personal, so they're not perpetrated by an individual, it's a freak event, a fire or an earthquake, that those are a lot less traumatic. People have a lower degree of post-traumatic stress disorder, and they have a higher level, they tend to grow more as a result of those sorts of events. Things that are personal traumas, so we're talking about rape here, we're talking about personal abuse by someone else. These are more traumatic. They tend to lead to higher rates. Combat is another one. They tend to lead to higher rates of PTSD. The rate of PTSD in combat is between 30 and 40%, whereas the mean of all the rates is more like 20 to 30%. And those tend to lead more to learned helplessness, particularly if they are repeated. So, when we talk about the certain percentage of people end up with PTSD, these are all the factors that go into it. And when a person ends up with PTSD, the good news is we have very good treatments for that. This is, for the vast majority of people, not at all a chronic condition if you get appropriate psychological treatment. The medicines don't work as well as the therapies. Therapies like cognitive behavior therapy, exposure therapy, cognitive processing therapy tend to work in the neighborhood of 70% of the time to help people to overcome what you're calling the learned helplessness or learned hopelessness that goes along with this, along with the nightmares and the flashbacks and the reliving and things like that. The interesting thing is that very often in the process of these therapies, now this is documented by research, in the process of these therapies, people grow. So an often not measured, but when you do measure it, you see it, outcome of therapy for post-traumatic stress disorder is post-traumatic growth.
So it's not just the individual, it's the environment and the kind of injury as well, and we think that luck has also something to do with it. You mentioned that this is not about recommending people to start jumping in front of cars, that trauma is terrible and awful and so on. To what extent are the people that you talk to have a sense that there was something in this experience that was worth it? That it's terrible to say I would do it again, but that they see it as an overall.
There's some positive.
Not some positive. Some positive I can see, but they see it overall as more positive than negative.
Well, I can answer that question from the research, but why don't you answer that question from the actual 17 Supersurvivors?
Well, I can even talk about that even just from my own personal experience. When I was going through treatment, somebody sent me a New York Times article. It was an op-ed that said, I am so glad that I got cancer. It changed my life, and now I'm doing things that I never thought I would do. Personally, that just really bothered me. I thought it was like the worst thing on earth. And I would give $1 million, I'd give $2 million, I'd give everything I'd ever earned to never have that experience. Because it was, as much as I grew from it, it was painful, it was hard. And I still think about that and think about, God, I never ever want to go through that, and I hope people I love and know don't go through that. So I think from a personal experience, I don't relate to that. And I think it depends on the super survivors you talk to. Some of them thought that, yeah, it actually turned out to be a pretty darn good thing, and they wouldn't change anything because that's the way life was supposed to happen, and that's what they do with it, and what they did with it was the only thing that they could do with it. Other people, we met a guy who was a businessman. He made millions and millions of dollars. This is a pretty quick story, but he made millions of dollars selling jambalaya. That's what he did. He sold jambalaya, went to business school.
The CEO of a company.
CEO of a company, right. I mean, he made a lot of money very fast. 9/11, as everybody did, they all felt the effects, the vicarious traumatic effects, even if you didn't know anybody who died in the attacks. His best friend was the co-pilot that hit the Pentagon. And he asked himself, okay, well, life is short. and this is, and I want to make the biggest impact I possibly can on the world. What can I do? He liquidated his assets, sold his company to his investors for a song, and moved into a parish and became a priest. And now he lives off $70 a month. And he was one of the first people back after Katrina hit New Orleans and helped rebuild that community. It was a remarkable story. I asked him, would you give all this up to have your friend back? And he said, without a doubt. Yeah. Without a doubt.
And I think the research coincides with what Lee is saying. If you ask people that 50 to 80% of people who grow in some way as a result of trauma, was it worth it? Was this growth like a really good thing? And people would always say, no, I'd trade in this growth to not have suffered
So there are people like Dan Gilbert that wrote Stumbling on Happiness and a lot of papers on this question, and it includes both a question of adaptation and growth, and he has the opposite perspective, right? So when I talk to him about my own experience, and I think
You are very much a super survivor, I think.
I don't, but...
yeah, that's another sign that you're a super survivor. I'm not one, you are.
But he thinks I'm wrong, right? When I say that I don't think it was worth it, he thinks I'm wrong because of the research on adaptation and inability to do this. Actually, I have one more question. So I have the kind of injury that I have lots of scars. Mm-hmm. And I've wondered whether having scars is actually a good reminder of how life, of the differences between being injured and not being injured. So if you think about somebody who think like you look in the mirror, other people see you, they don't see anything, and you don't see it yourself. You just have to think about it or remember it. There's some injuries that you just have the constant reminder of that. Is this, and I can think about why that would be good and why it could be bad, right? It's a reminder of how life would look like. At the same time, it's a reminder that I'm alive. Nevertheless, after some challenges.
It's a good question. I don't know, perhaps you do know of research that supports this. I can tell you that when we talked to some of the super survivors, particularly for the chapter on social support, one of the things that they said to us was, because we talked to two people who had brain injuries for that chapter, and the thing that's common to a person who has a brain injury is that they look perfectly normal, even though they may have trouble finding words, doing math, thinking straight, planning. They may have immense emotional difficulties. Lee mentioned Jane McGonigal, who was very depressed and even at one point was suicidal and felt very isolated, and yet her friends treated her very normal. So she felt very alone and isolated. And we did hear people say, I wish that I had something that would make me look more traumatized, so that I wouldn't have to constantly be explaining it, so that people would care for me in a different way. I don't know what the numbers are behind that sort of thing, but I do think that happens. So, I've seen that clinically too.
So the argument is that there could be an element of the person thinking about their own life, but there could be also the environmental factor. Absolutely. Where other people just stop thinking of you as being sick or injured or need help.
And yes, and often will withdraw their support because they look at you and you look perfectly normal. So
you're fine. What do you need my help for?
What do you need my help for?
So you mentioned a few times social support. Seems to be very important. It's important for lots of good functioning. If you were giving a recommendation for somebody who's recently injured in terms of how to improve their social networking, what outside of switching from Facebook to Google Plus?
Yeah, that's right.
Of course, that would be the recommendation. I mean, that's number one. I can take this, and it's a counterintuitive recommendation. So the research, and certainly our experience with the super survivors and my clinical experience, shows very clearly that one of the number one protective factors against the effects of trauma, one of the number one things that allows people to bounce back and even forward after trauma, is social support. But there is a twist here, and it's a big twist. And that is that it's possible to be surrounded by people who love you and care for you and want to support you and not realize it. That this is one of those areas in psychology where perception and reality are actually two different things and can be separated. Trauma is incredibly alienating, and people in the aftermath of trauma often withdraw. The majority of people withdraw to a certain degree. A lot of people believe no one could possibly understand what they're going through. So they could literally be surrounded, we could literally be surrounded by a sea, or virtually be surrounded by a sea of social support, and think we're in a desert. And so the advice that I would give is notice the support that is there for you. It turns out it doesn't take a lot of support.
Right.
It just takes you noticing it, being open to it, and accessing it. That perception that people are there for you turns out to be far more psychologically important than having some huge support network. So notice it.
I guess that's really good news for Google+.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's lots of research that shows that these sorts of networks are effective in helping people bounce forward.
Great. Yes?
One of the things that seems to be a recurring theme in a lot of these stories is that people realize that they don't have to follow the rules that they were set out to have before.
Yeah.
And maybe they have different values. And I can imagine a lot of other life circumstances that have that effect, like, kids go away to college, or, you get out of prison, or lots of things like this. Like, how similar is it to other things that might cause you to abandon the rules and value something different?
So you're asking, can you get the benefits without the costs? Can you get like the life growth, minimizing bodily harm?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank God the answer is yes. I mean, my God, wouldn't it just be horrible if you were just living in this matrix stupor your whole life, and it took getting punched in the face or with the trauma to have this moment of wake up. No, thank God. And one of the things are, the people we spoke to in this book, the super survivors here, it took trauma to do it. And many of them told us that it doesn't have to be trauma, it just happened to be trauma for them. So like you said, getting out of prison, having your kids go off to college, something needs to shake you out of this. In many cases, for the people in our book, the super survivors we spoke to, it was facing death. I mean, that had the most profound effect on most of these people.
And by the way, there's lots of research that shows, there's lots of research that shows that, that people can face death without actually facing death. So there was this researcher whose last name is Cozolino, I think it's Philip Cozolino, who did a number of studies a number of years ago, and where he had research participants, college students mostly, but also who don't think a lot about death, but come into a lab, and he simply had them reflect on how they might die, what would happen to their body after they died, and then reflect, like I did in my class, what has your life exemplified up until now, and what would you like it to mean? And it turns out that if you have people do that, they get less greedy, they become more spiritual, they become more invested in their own personal intrinsic goals, they start to break some of the rules of achieving extrinsic goals that society wants for them. So, and I think we talk a lot about that sort of thing in our book and say, we can learn from these stories, we don't have to have gone through this.
I think maybe on a social level, I think maybe on a Google scale or something like that, how do you make a society where people are encouraged to follow their, find their own rules kind of situation?
That is too big of a question to answer in 1 minute.
It's a great cause to look into. I would love for there to be something like that would just get them there.
To me like a Disneyland ride that gets you to be a super survivor at the end. You get to face death. You get to reflect on life.
I do think to the extent that we can put a sense of control over people's lives into their hands. I mean, I think, for instance, I think that YouTube is a wonderful example of how you're putting tools into somebody's hands to have control to be able to achieve goals. I think to the extent that we can say, here are the controls, do something with them. Those are ingredients, at least in my research, to the degree that people believe they're behind the levers of control and creation, they tend to feel more hopeful and they tend to behave in more intrinsic ways. That's a quick answer, but it's a complex question.
And like all good things, thank you very much. I just want to say on a personal note, I get about twice a week, I get an email from somebody who just was injured. And they ask me questions they really want to ask questions about their own lives. So last week I got an email actually from a young girl, actually an aunt of a young girl that her jealous boyfriend spilled acid on her face.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so I get lots of these emails from people who are really struggling. These are people who just got injured. They're in the first step. I think it's unclear what kind of path they will take, and they ask me for some feedback, some advice, some insight into how life would look like. And lots of time I give them kind of practical things in terms of how you find passion and interest and so on. But I think your work kind of gives another dimension to it in terms of what are the elements that you need to explore, and how do you get back a feeling of control. And I think the social elements are incredibly important. So I thank you very much, and this was a great book and topic and very important. And I
Oh, thank
appreciate
you very
it.
much. Thank you. Thank you.